We are pleased to be joined by Angela Sims, a Barnard Columbia professor and author of Fighting for a Foothold, to discuss some of the inequalities that persist between Black and white suburbs, some of the themes from her book as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Brandon.
Yeah, the pleasure's all ours. So I want to start kind of broad, as I think, especially from some like conservatives, some other like people on the right, they'll scoff at even the notion of racism or racial disparities existing. So could you just lay out what some of these disparities are that you cover from like schools, public spaces, water, even these things?
Certainly, the book focuses on local jurisdictions and thinking about the capacity of their tax bases to generate sufficient tax revenue. So, tax bases that would be the locally generated funding as well as what's transferred from the federal and state government. So, to your point about inequities across racial groups, we have to remember, as much as it may be challenging for us to want to think that far back in history, is that a lot of the things that I'm describing really date back to the origins of this country. And so that means we have to talk about the original fiction that was created of this thing, of this hierarchy called race, right? That race does not map to actual human variation. And so, as my colleague Dorothy Roberts says, it's a political category, meaning that we've ascribed meaning to phenotype in order to justify the uneven distribution of benefits and burdens in society. And that's important to remember because that's what starts, that's the foundation upon which this country is built. And so, essentially, what we have over time is never the repudiation of that basic dynamic of white people benefiting at Black people's expense, but rather a rearticulation of it through different political regimes. So you have Jim Crow racism after slavery, and then you have the modern civil rights movement, of course, which ushers in laws like the Civil Rights Act of '64, which starts to diminish some of these disparities. But certainly, it's paltry compared to the need. And even as you have the rise of the Black middle class, you also have the rise of mass incarceration, which is a way also of controlling Black people. So we know that Black folk and white folk, for example, use drugs at the same rate, but Black folk are overrepresented in jails and prisons. And so really what this book is capturing is how, in terms of public goods and services, Black people still receive fewer returns for their tax contributions, right? So they're paying the same in taxes as white folk, but because of these policies and structures that I'm happy to unpack that exist today, including things like racial residential segregation, Black folks still have a lower quality of life.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of going into what my next question was going to be was how does this look in practice? What are, whether it's the policies, the mechanisms, the structures that sort of allow this systemic disparity to exist?
Right. So I think that picking up with the Jim Crow period, which was established through this idea of separate but equal. Separate was never but never equal. So Plessy v. Ferguson establishes that because you had to have at least some veneer to seemingly abide by the 14th Amendment, which guarantees every citizen equal protection of the laws. So if you're going to treat Black people differently than white folk, you had to at least have the veneer that, oh, it's separate, but it's supposedly equal. So we're not actually diminishing Black people's rights. But what we know is that Black people are, as I said, paying taxes, so they're working. And we think about, like working class people. I think that's a good place to park our car because sometimes, we think about, people who are earning college degrees and who seemingly have more resources. I think we can see actually how Black and white working class and poor people are treated differently. So let's take the 1935 Social Security Act, which establishes for the first time old age pensions and unemployment insurance. Well, Black folk are excluded for the first two generations from that major federal investment in U.S. citizens because that law excludes the categories of work where Black folk are concentrated, which is domestic labor and farm labor. We can take the Wagner Act and collective bargaining and worker protections that come through around that same period under Roosevelt. And Black folk are either excluded from unions, or if they're incorporated into unions, they are incorporated as second unsubordinated roles. So we can see that these on-ramps to opportunity, whether that's federal support for old age and unemployment, whether that's your actual working conditions or your worker pay that comes through a process of collective bargaining, and then also where you live. So we can think about how local laws like zoning laws will decide where you're going to put polluting industries. So Black neighborhoods are more likely to host the polluting industries, whereas white neighborhoods, irrespective of class, are more likely to have zoning that protects their lungs, that does not expose them to those kinds of harms. We also know that in terms of separate but equal, the school systems that we know that, schools are funded by local and state governments, local governments that are majority Black are not getting the same kinds of funding from the state. And because market actors and government invest less in Black spaces, the market value of those properties is lower. So when you use things like property taxes, Black folk are systematically disadvantaged in terms of even raising the revenue. So there's a way in which it's a self-fulfilling prophecy then. You underinvest in Black people in Black spaces, then you force Black people to raise revenue on the very thing you underinvest in. And those things those things you underinvest in are not only important for their quality of life, but they also, as I said, are that mechanism that's determining the tax base that you're then leveling a rate on to generate the revenue. So it's really thinking about how across levels of government, as well as how market actors are, quite frankly, preying upon Black people. So most recently, this happened with the foreclosure crisis, where irrespective of credit rating, Black people were targeted, Black communities were targeted for toxic mortgages that did not have fully amortized payments. They had balloon payments, they had variable interest rates, whereas white folk were less likely to have those kinds of mortgages in the first place. So that harmed Black families, that harmed Black neighborhoods, that harmed Black local government. So we can just kind of go throughout history and name a number of systemic ways in which Black people do not have the same experiences as white Americans.
I'm curious your thoughts on why, because to me, and I mean, you just laid out the case pretty well as well, that there's tons of empirical evidence to support this idea of systemic racism, essentially, like these racial disparities that structures and policies can create. Why do you think then there is still such a pushback from some, kind of, as I mentioned, who will scoff even at the notion when there is so much just overwhelming evidence to support it as a reality?
Christian often use the language of discipleship, and I will say that many white Americans, irrespective of their religious beliefs, including many who claim to be Christians, have been conditioned and discipled into whiteness, right? So their first identity is whiteness. So if we go back to the beginning, we can think about how at the very beginning of this country, you had multiple labor arrangements. So chattel slavery, this idea that you would build your economic system on the enslavement of people, meaning they will work for free without any compensation. They have no rights that a white man is bound to respect, in the words of Justice Taney in the Dred Scott case. That fiction was used to actually hold together what was an inherently, and still is, an inherently unstable system. Because the majority of white people do not benefit at maximum levels from racialized capitalism, which racial capitalism, to be clear, is profit generation through racial difference. But what you did convince poor white people of, or working class white people of, is that they're not Black, meaning they're not written out of humanity. There is some way in which they're protected from the harshest edges of capitalism. And so this belief that I'm not a Black person, right? This idea of creating a dichotomy or a hierarchy that's anchored by Blackness at the bottom and whiteness at the top, means that white folk who are not elite buy into a system that ultimately is not in their best economic interest. Their best economic interests are really solidarity with Black folk. So you see this develop through what we call the slave codes. For example, in 1676, you had Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, and these were Black and white folk who were seeking to move west, which of course was going to be snatching land from indigenous people, but they were seeking to get out from under the planter class. They were trying to have their opportunity to succeed on their own terms and not through the mechanisms that the planter class had created through commodities like tobacco, etc. And so when the rebellion is put down by the elite white folk, they treat the Black and the white, at this point, we're talking Africans and Europeans, we had a quite established racial hierarchy in the explicit terms we have now, they treat them differently. So now the white folkers, they are essentially seeing that there are economic and political benefits to identification with whiteness. So I start with that, because I think what you see then are the stakes. The stakes could not be higher, right, in terms of the brutality that Black people will continue to experience. And so even after Reconstruction, which is what happens after the Civil War in 1865, you see that white folk who are poor are going to continue to believe that their lot should still be cast with the planter elite as opposed to Black people. There are these moments of populism, farm unions and others. And actually, that's when you see people killed, quite frankly. Even Dr. King is killed when he's mounting a poor people's campaign. So this is the 20th century, mounting a poor people's campaign between Black folk and indigenous folk and poor folk in Appalachia. And he's calling out this evil triplet of materialism, racism, and militarism. And a year to the day after he makes that speech, bro got to go. He's assassinated, because that is the linchpin of this country. If you do not have racial capitalism built on this idea of racial difference, of who is owed something from this country and who is not, then the whole fiction falls. And so I think the resistance you feel is for people in power seeking to maintain a system that, as I said from the beginning, has been inherently unstable because there's been hoarding and there continues to be hoarding by people at the top. And they don't want that conversation. What they want you to do is look sideways and not up. Rather than look at your neighbor, you should be looking up at the people who are hoarding the resources, creating these conditions, and then using scapegoats to deflect from who's actually causing this economic pain that we're all experiencing.
And I'm really excited that you brought up capitalism there, because that's one of my questions. You always hear a lot of people when, we talk about various outcomes the market can create and things that's like, well, that's, bad capitalism, or it's crony capitalism, or it's this or that. How much of these racial disparities do you think is just inherent to capitalism as a system itself? Because we've seen things like the Civil Rights Act, these other legislations supposed to bring equality, yet these disparities still exist, which could speak obviously to like a larger problem with the system itself.
I think that's a great question. This is both a great policy question as well as an academic question that people like me sit and consider. So there are some folk who say that essentially what capitalism is looking for is an other. They're looking for an exploitable class. And so some scholars will make a distinction between those who are exploited. So we can say that white working class people are exploited, they're underpaid, they're alienated from their work, the value of their labor is still going to capitalists. But then there are those who are expropriated from, and those who are expropriated from and not exploited are those who have, as Justice Sadie said, no rights anyone is bound to respect. So this expropriated group means that there is nothing that I owe you, right? You are merely a means to an end. So we can think about how indigenous people experience this because we just took their land. I say we in the royal we says because it was a black folk. This was, again, white elites taking the indigenous people's land. Or in the case of black folk, you have no rights I'm bound to respect. I can enslave you, rape you, do whatever I want to you because you exist as a thing. You are objectified. And so some scholars will say that you really just need an other, exploitable and expropriated class, and others will say no, race is inherently built into the history of capitalism. I don't know that that's quite the right question. I think that if you look at the history in the sense that we need to debate, whether it's race or some other group, I think that the history shows that it is race as the quintessential differentiator. Because what you can do is look, as I just described, you can look at how working class whites are differentiated from working class blacks and poor blacks, right? So we know that even today with the wealth gap, that 2 college educated black folk on average will have less wealth than 2 high school educated white folk. And that shows you the history of the cumulative differences in investment in black people and white people. You can look at women and differentiations of one woman. We know that even during the slave era, white women were given, even though they didn't vote and they had, certainly were subordinated to white men, exceptions were made in state laws in order to allow white women to inherit enslaved property because they wanted to be able to both maintain the slave system and they wanted to be able to have a particular kind of lifestyle. So we can see that even though these other social markers of the other hierarchies are important with, for things like reproductive labor, meaning the things that capitalism relies on but doesn't compensate, we still know that black people are the bottom rung. And we know that every group goes out of its way to distinguish itself from blackness. So we know that white women, go out of their way to create this fiction of femininity and purity and all of these things, as opposed to who? Black women, who are supposedly at the bottom. We know that in terms of class, poor white people and poor black people do not have the same opportunities and constraints as they're seeking upward mobility and seeking to maintain that upward mobility. We know that, among all racial groups, that black people and indigenous people have borne the brunt of capitalism. And so, and that the original accumulation that white elites have today, that advantage that they use today to continue the regime of, economic and political regime, reflects that original history. So in some ways, it's kind of a moot point. The horse is out of the barn, it's running laps, we can debate this, in terms of which category, but it's clear, as you said from the outset, from the data, that it is blackness and anti-blackness, and really this dualism of anti-blackness and white domination that continues to govern the political and economic systems of this country.